In the early summer of 1983, the engineers who ran one of the largest dams in the United States stood on top of that great wall of concrete and felt something no one who builds a dam ever wants to feel. Beneath their feet, the dam was shaking. A deep, ominous rumbling rose up from within the structure, a vibration they could feel in their bones. And out of the openings, at the base of the dam, came a terrifying sign, water-stained red, running dark with pulverized rock. The dam was, quite literally, tearing pieces of itself and the canyon apart from the inside, and for a few harrowing days, the people responsible for it feared they were watching the beginning of a catastrophe that could unleash a wall of water across the American Southwest. This is the story of Glen Canyon Dam, and of the summer it came closer to failing than almost anyone realized at the time. It is a story of an extraordinary flood, of a fatal flaw in the dam's design, of frantic engineers improvising desperately to save the structure, and of just how narrow the margin was between control and catastrophe. It is a gripping and sobering tale from the history of the American West, one that most people have never heard. But it is also something more than history, because the conditions that brought the dam to the brink in that dangerous summer are not gone. They can return. And there is a growing concern that the scenario of 1983, the flood that nearly tore the dam apart, could one day repeat itself. In this video, we are going to relive that harrowing summer in detail. We will look at what Glen Canyon Dam is and why it matters so much to the entire region. We will explore how an unexpected flood filled the great reservoir behind it faster than anyone anticipated, forcing the operators to do something they had never done before, and how that decision revealed a hidden weakness that nearly destroyed the dam from within. We will follow the desperate efforts to hold the structure together, and we will consider the chilling question of whether it could all happen again in a future of increasingly extreme and unpredictable weather. Stay with me, because this is one of the most dramatic and least understood near disasters in the history of the West, and its lessons are more relevant today than ever. Hashtag the Great Dam on the River. To understand the danger, you first have to understand what Glen Canyon Dam is and the enormous responsibility it carries. It is a massive concrete dam, one of the tallest in the country, wedged into a deep canyon on one of the great rivers of the American West. Behind it lies an immense reservoir, one of the largest artificial bodies of water on the continent, a vast lake that snakes for many miles through the red rock canyons of the desert. The dam and its reservoir are a central piece of the entire system that stores and controls the river's water, holding back an enormous volume of water and releasing it in a managed way to serve the needs of the region. The purpose of this dam is immense. It stores water in a place where water is the most precious resource of all, banking the flow of the river so that it can be doled out reliably to the states, cities, and farms that depend on it, even through the dry years. It generates a great deal of electricity as the water passes through it, power that feeds the grid across a wide area. And crucially, it works in concert with other great dams downstream, forming a chain of control along the river that manages the water for the entire region. Glen Canyon Dam is not just a wall of concrete. It is a linchpin of the whole system that makes modern life in the desert Southwest possible. But a dam of this size holds within it a terrible potential as well as an immense benefit. Behind that wall sits an unimaginable weight of water, held back only by the strength of the structure and the skill of those who operate it. A dam is a bargain with a river, a promise that human engineering can tame and control a force of nature. Most of the time, that bargain holds, and the dam does its work quietly and reliably, year after year. But every so often, nature tests the bargain, pushing the dam to the very edge of what it was built to withstand. And in the summer of 1983, that test came, in the form of a flood that no one had adequately prepared for. Hashtag the flood no one expected. The trouble began, as it so often does in these stories, in the mountains far upstream, where the water that feeds the great river is born as snow. Through the winter, an enormous amount of snow had accumulated in the high country, building up a vast frozen reservoir on the mountainsides, far more than in an ordinary year. This alone was not necessarily a disaster, because a big snowpack, if it melts slowly and steadily, can be managed. The danger comes when the melt happens too fast, when a sudden turn in the weather sends all that stored water rushing down into the rivers in a great surge rather than a gradual flow. And that is exactly what happened. As spring turned towards summer, the weather shifted in a way that sent the enormous snowpack melting rapidly, and a huge volume of water came pouring down out of the mountains and into the river system, far more and far faster than had been anticipated. The reservoir behind the dam, which is meant to catch and store this runoff, began to fill at an alarming rate. The water level climbed and climbed, rising toward the top of the dam, and the operators faced a situation they had hoped never to encounter. The reservoir was filling faster than they could safely release water through the dam's normal outlets, and the level was approaching the point where the water would threaten to spill over the top of the structure, which for most dams would be a catastrophic scenario. The operators had one option left to relieve the pressure: a set of massive spillways built into the dam precisely for this purpose, great tunnels designed to carry excess water safely around and past the structure when the reservoir rose too high. These spillways had been built as an emergency measure, a safety valve for exactly this kind of situation, and yet in all the years the dam had operated, they had essentially never been needed in earnest. Now, with the water rising toward the top of the dam, the operators had no choice. They opened the spillways and sent the floodwaters roaring down through them, trusting that this emergency system would carry the excess safely away. But something was about to go terribly wrong, revealing a hidden and dangerous flaw that no one had fully anticipated. The dam begins to tear itself apart at first. The spillways did their job, channeling the enormous flow of water down and away from the reservoir. But before long, the operators began to notice signs that something was deeply wrong. The dam started to rumble and shake in a way it never had before, a deep and frightening vibration emanating from within the structure. And then came the most alarming sign of all. The water coming out of the spillways, which should have been relatively clean, began to run red and dark, stained with the color of pulverized rock. The dam was somehow grinding up rock and spitting it out, and that could only mean one thing: something inside the spillways was being torn apart. The cause was a phenomenon that is one of the great enemies of high-speed water systems, a destructive process that can occur when water moves at tremendous velocity through a channel. When water rushes through a confined space fast enough, it can create zones of extremely low pressure, and in those zones, tiny bubbles of vapor form and then violently collapse, generating shockwaves of astonishing force. Repeated over and over in the same spots, these collapses can hammer at even the strongest concrete, chipping and eroding it away, and once the surface is breached, the process accelerates catastrophically. This is what was happening deep inside the spillways of the dam. The floodwaters, roaring through the tunnels at enormous speed, had triggered this destructive process, and it was chewing through the concrete lining of the spillways and beginning to gouge into the very rock of the canyon beneath. The red water was the evidence, the ground-up sandstone of the canyon being blasted out of the spillways as the water tore ever deeper into the structure. Enormous holes were being carved into the spillway tunnels, growing larger by the hour, and the terrible fear was that if the process continued unchecked, the damage could eat its way back toward the dam itself, undermining the structure and potentially leading to a failure of unimaginable consequences. The very system that was supposed to save the dam from the flood was instead threatening to destroy it. The operators were caught in a nightmare, needing to release the floodwater to keep the reservoir from overtopping the dam, but finding that the act of releasing it through the damaged spillways was tearing the whole system apart. They were trapped between two catastrophes. The desperate fight to save the dam. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes of improvisational engineering in the history of American dams. The people responsible for the structure had to think fast and act faster, working under enormous pressure to prevent the reservoir from overtopping the dam while somehow limiting the destruction being wrought inside the spillways. The situation demanded creativity, nerve, and no small amount of luck. One of the key challenges was buying time and reducing the flow through the ravaged spillways, and to do that, the operators needed to raise the effective height of the dam to gain just a little more capacity to hold water back so they would not have to send as much through the failing spillways. Their solution was strikingly low-tech given the stakes. They rushed to build makeshift barriers on top of the dam's spillway gates, temporary additions cobbled together to raise the height of the water the dam could hold by a few precious feet. These improvised barriers, simple in concept and hurriedly constructed, bought the operators a small but vital margin, allowing them to store a bit more water and reduce the punishing flow through the spillways while they fought to manage the crisis. They also worked to control and limit the spillway flows as much as possible, balancing the competing dangers with painstaking care, releasing enough water to keep the reservoir from cresting the dam, but not so much that the spillways would be destroyed outright. It was an agonizing tightrope walk, conducted over days, with the fate of the dam and everything downstream hanging in the balance. Engineers monitored the damage, listened to the ominous rumbling, watched the red water, and made calculated decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty and fear, and all the while, they could only hope that the flood would crest, that the inflow would begin to subside before the damage grew catastrophic. In the end, the desperate measures held. The improvised barriers and the careful management of the flows carried the dam through the peak of the flood. The reservoir stopped rising just in time. The inflow finally began to decline, and the operators were able to reduce and then halt the flow through the battered spillways. The dam had survived. But it had been a terrifyingly close call. Hashtag how close it really came in the aftermath, as the floodwaters receded and engineers were able to inspect the damage. The true severity of what had happened became clear, and it was sobering. The spillways had been savaged. Inside the tunnels, the destructive process had carved out enormous cavities, tearing through the concrete and blasting deep into the rock of the canyon, leaving craters and gouges of shocking size. The damage was a stark physical record of just how violently the system had been attacking itself, and of how much force had been unleashed inside the structure. But the more chilling realization was how narrow the margin of safety had truly been. Had the flood been somewhat larger, had the snowmelt been a little faster, or the inflow a little greater, had the improvised measures failed, or the damage progressed faster, the outcome could have been very different. The experts who studied the event afterward understood that the dam had come genuinely close to a far worse fate, that the destructive process eating through the spillways could, under slightly different circumstances, have threatened the integrity of the dam itself, and a failure of a dam of that size, holding back that enormous volume of water, would have been a catastrophe almost beyond imagining, sending an immense flood surging down the river, threatening everything and everyone downstream, including the other great dams and the communities along the river's path. This is the part of the story that so few people appreciate. To the outside world, the crisis was largely invisible. There was no dramatic collapse, no wall of water, no headline catastrophe. The dam held, the flood passed, and life went on. But those who were there, those who felt the dam shaking beneath their feet and watched the red water pouring from the spillways, knew how close the region had come to disaster. It was a near miss of the most serious kind. A catastrophe averted by a combination of frantic ingenuity, careful judgment, and good fortune, and it left a lasting mark on everyone who understood what had truly been at stake. Hashtag the lessons and the fix the crisis of that summer was a hard and valuable lesson, and in its aftermath, a great deal of work went into understanding what had gone wrong and making sure it could not happen again in the same way. The engineers studied the destructive process that had ravaged the spillways, and they set about repairing the enormous damage and modifying the spillways to protect against a repeat of the disaster. The key insight was that the destructive phenomenon that had torn through the tunnels could be prevented, or at least greatly reduced, by changing the way water flowed through the spillways. The solution involved introducing air into the flow at critical points, a modification designed to disrupt the conditions that allowed the destructive bubbles to form and collapse against the concrete. By altering the spillways in this way, engineers hoped to ensure that even in a future flood, when the spillways might once again be called upon, they would be able to carry the water without tearing themselves apart. The damage from the crisis was repaired, the tunnels rebuilt and reinforced, and the improvements put in place, so that the dam would be better prepared the next time a great flood came. These fixes were real and important, and they addressed the specific mechanical flaw that had caused the near disaster. The dam is safer now than it was in that dangerous summer, better equipped to handle the kind of flood that once nearly destroyed it. but it would be a mistake to conclude that the danger has been entirely eliminated or that a crisis could never come again. Because the fundamental situation, a great dam holding back an enormous reservoir dependent on spillways to survive an extreme flood, remains. The fixes reduced the risk, but they did not remove the underlying reality that this dam, like all dams, must ultimately face whatever the river and the weather throw at it. Why 1983 could repeat, and this brings us to the most pressing question of all, the reason this old story matters so urgently today. Could the events of that dangerous summer happen again? The sobering answer is that the conditions which produced the crisis are not relics of the past. They can return, and there are reasons to believe that the risk of a similar event may even be growing. The crisis was, at its heart, the product of an extreme flood, an unusually large and fast snowmelt that overwhelmed the system's ability to manage it. And here is the crucial point about our changing climate. While much of the recent story of the region has been about drought and shrinking reservoirs, a warming climate does not simply make things drier. It makes the weather more extreme and more volatile in both directions, capable of producing not only deeper droughts, but also, in some years, more intense bursts of precipitation and more sudden, rapid snowmelt. The same forces that can starve the river for years can also, in a given year, unleash a torrent. This whiplash between extremes, long dry spells punctuated by sudden deluges, is exactly the kind of pattern that can set the stage for a dangerous flood. There is a particular danger hidden in the long drought itself. After years of low water, when a reservoir has been drawn down and the region has grown accustomed to scarcity, the arrival of a huge water year can catch the system off guard. A big snowpack melting rapidly into a reservoir, combined with the pressures of managing a system stretched to its limits, could recreate the essential conditions of the crisis, a surge of water forcing the operators once again to rely on the spillways to save the dam. The improvements made after the near disaster would be put to the test, and while they are designed to prevent a repeat of the specific failure, no one can be entirely certain how the aging structure and its systems would perform under the full fury of an even greater flood. The concern, then, is not that a repeat is certain, but that it is possible, that the consequences of failure would be so catastrophic that the possibility cannot be ignored. A future of climate whiplash, of drought and deluge in unpredictable succession, is precisely the environment in which a great flood could once again bear down on the dam, testing it as it was tested in that harrowing summer. And whether the lessons learned and the fixes made would be enough in the face of an even more extreme event is a question that hangs over the entire region. So the story of Glen Canyon Dam and its dangerous summer is far more than a dramatic tale from the history books. It is a warning, a reminder that even our greatest works of engineering exist at the mercy of forces far larger than ourselves, and that the line between control and catastrophe can be terrifyingly thin. The dam that nearly tore itself apart survived because of the desperate ingenuity of the people who fought to save it, and because of a measure of luck, and its brush with disaster taught hard lessons that made it safer. But safety is never absolute, and the river and the weather do not forget. The great dams of the West are enormous responsibilities, structures that must be watched, maintained, and understood, because behind each of them sits a weight of water that could unleash catastrophe if the structure ever failed. The crisis of that summer is a vivid reminder of the stakes, of what can happen when nature pushes a dam to the edge of what it can withstand, and of how close such a disaster can come without the wider world ever fully knowing. As the climate grows more extreme and the swings between drought and flood grow wider, the lessons of that dangerous summer become more relevant, not less. The possibility that the scenario could one day repeat, that a great flood could once again bear down on the dam and test it to its limits, is a real and serious concern that deserves attention and preparation. The dam still stands, holding back its immense reservoir, doing its quiet work day after day. But somewhere in the mountains upstream, in some future winter, the snow may pile up as it did before, and some future spring may melt it too fast, and the operators may once again find themselves standing atop that great wall of concrete, feeling it rumble beneath their feet, hoping that this time, as last time, it will hold. The story of 1983 is not only history, it is a glimpse of a danger that has never truly gone away, and that